So I'm quickly going to create myself a piece of abstract artwork. So that's my model. I'm just going to place this somewhere in the scene that I think it looks good. And then I'll assign it a material. And now we can look at how we can apply a texture to an object without UV unwrapping. And to demonstrate this, I've created this simple scene with a simple image assigned using UVs to both of these objects. And just to recap, the UVs are shown over here as X and Y. And in 3D, these are actually, if we can look at them, Shift AS, down a UV map node. But plug this in, these are shown by red and green. So red is X and green is Y. 0 in the bottom corner, 1 over here, so this is fully red as we can see there, and 0 to 1 on the Y. At the top it's going to be fully green. In the bottom corner it's going to be completely black. In the top right, where both are equal to 1, it's going to be yellow. Alright, so the way we can automatically create UVs for us is using a Shift A, and I'll put down a coordinate, a texture coordinate node. This has also got the UV output on it. Plug that in there, we'll get exactly the same result. But we've also got different methods. The first one we'll look at is window. So window is going to place the texture over the window in its entirety. So the bottom left-hand corner will be the bottom left corner of the image, and the top right-hand corner of the window will be the top right-hand corner of the image as well. So as I zoom in on here, we can actually see that. And it will span across the entire scene, so it will be sort of static on multiple objects. And you'll notice that on this sphere, there is no distortion to conform to the contours of the geometry. It's just a flat 2D image. Next up, we've got camera. So camera is very similar to window, but it actually places the image at the center of the object, so at the center of the window. So 0, 0 of the image, bottom left-hand corner, is going to be at the middle point of the camera's view. And as we zoom in, you can see the distance from the camera to the object will dictate the size of the image. And also, it will distort the image to the contours of the 3D geometry as well. If we turn on repeat on the image here, we can see the effect across the entire scene. Next up, we've got reflection. So this is useful for emulating reflected textures that have been reflected by an object. So for example, here we can see, if we're looking, it's a bit like looking inside of a mirror. This is quite useful for maybe an office building window where you want to put a texture showing the inside of the building, and you want it to be able to sort of move around as you walk past it, to emulate an actual 3D environment behind the window, which in actual fact is just a texture. That would be a very simple way of doing it. There are better ways to do that, but just as an example. But most commonly it's used for creating false reflections from a HDRI environment map. So I've created this environment texture. If I plug this now into the surface, and now plug the reflection into the vector, you can see it's reflecting this texture. It's showing this texture on the object, but it's making it the opposite of what it is in the 3D viewport. So the HDRI environment, you can see in this area, we've got the tree, and that's reflecting correctly over here. So it can be quite useful for that purpose. The next one we've got is normal. So the normal coordinates, we just plug this into this one. These will base the placement of the texture on the direction that each face is pointing in relation to the local coordinate system. So if they're pointing directly up, we go to the top view, we can see that the corner, if we look directly from the top, is exactly on the face, which is pointing straight upwards, straight towards the local Z. Just turn off repeat. Then it will stretch the image based on the angle that each face is pointing. So just to look at this, we go across, plug the normal directly into the output. You can see the faces that are pointing straight up are blue. The ones that are pointing towards the x-axis are red. And the ones that are pointing towards the y-axis are green. So that's how that would work. And it can be quite useful for emulating or getting the texture to sort of move around in a fluid way on a surface that is being deformed. So let me just show you what I mean by that. I'll just turn on repeat so we can see it across the entire image. Go into edit mode. If I move one of these vertices around, you'll see the texture is going to sort of be deformed along with it, but not in a perfect way. It's not sticking to the surface. It's sort of deforming in a more fluid way. And the normal coordinates are also useful for placing different colours on an object based on which direction the faces are pointing. So for example, let's say you had a mountain and you wanted to put snow just on the faces that are pointing upwards. Then we could do that, for example, like this. So Shift A, S, I'll put down a mix node, make it a Shift A, S, a mixed colour node, and I'll make the B socket white, and then I'll make the top socket black. If we look at these normal coordinates, Shift A, S, and I'll separate them so we can look at the X, Y, and Z individually. And we'll go to the Y, pointing that way, and then Z is pointing upwards. So any face that's sort of pointing towards the object's local Z axis is going to be represented here by white. Because it would have been blue, but because we've separated it out, we can see only the blue, which is then translated to white by the separate XYZ node. So what I want to do is plug this Z into the factor of the mix node, and the mix node works, just to explain, the factor controls whether the bottom or the top socket gets used. If the factor is set to 1, or the input receives a white colour, then it will be the bottom socket. If the factor is set to 0, or the input receives a black colour, then the top socket will be used. So let's plug this into the factor, which contains black and white. We've got white on the top, black on the bottom. If we then plug this over into the output, we can see that we're getting the black colour at the bottom and the white colour at the top. If I change this to a different colour, maybe red, make it a bit more obvious what's happening, and this one green, then we can see the result. So that's how it can also be useful for that. And if you wanted your snow to be on the side, say the wind's been blowing this way, and you only want your snow to be appearing on this side, then we could plug in the x-axis instead. And then our green snow is going to be pointing towards the positive x, and any faces that aren't pointed towards positive x will now get pink. And finally, the two last remaining options are generated and object. So these are the two that you're basically most likely to be using, one of these two, generated or object. So let's have a look what happens if I go across to this object, and we'll get rid of all this rubbish now. I'll plug this in, we'll get rid of the Christmas thing as well, and I'll plug generated into the image. So it's working fine in this case because we plug this in and we come across here, Shift A, S, and I'll separate these out so that we can see the X and the Y. So the X is working fine, the Y is working fine, the Z is irrelevant because the 2D image here has only got X and Y. So it's going to map the X and Y positions of the image onto the X and Y colours generated here by the texture coordinate node. We plug that in, we can see that works fine. Now what's going to happen is if I go across here and I extrude these out, on the side, nothing's been mapped on because obviously this is going to be the Z coordinate. And the image doesn't have a Z coordinate, so it can't do anything with these sides. It can only do things with the top and the bottom that have got X and Y, both X and Y input. So how do we fix this? How do we get the 2D image to take advantage of 3D texture coordinates? Well, what we need to do, very simply, is change the image from being flat to be one of these three shapes, either a box, a sphere, or a tube. And then it will place that image onto each face of that shape that we've chosen so that it can get the Z coordinates from that 3D shape. And then it's going to work. And if we come across to the sphere, and I'll just turn down blend to 0, you'll notice we get a very harsh transition. We can get rid of that by just turning up the blend a little bit to make that less noticeable. One benefit of using generated nodes is that if we've got a deforming object, the textures will stick to it perfectly. So let me show you what I mean. I'm going to select the sphere this time. I'm going to go into the data panel and create a shape key base and then a shape key to modify. I'll go into edit mode and I'm going to turn on proportional editing and we'll just make a modification to it like this. Come out of edit mode, and now when I change the value of this, you'll notice the textures will stretch along and stick to the surface perfectly. So it's really useful to use generated if you've got a deforming mesh and you want the texture to stick to it. It's worth noting as well that the coordinates that are generated by this texture coordinate node are actually based on the geometry's position inside of a texture space box. So let's have a look at this texture space box. We can see it here. We've got texture space. If I set this to automatic texture, we can come to the properties for this object and we'll turn on texture space. This is going to show us the box that is used to get these coordinates from. And basically, the coordinates used are based on each element of this geometry's position inside of this XYZ bounding box. And in turn, this bounding box's rotation is based on the local orientation of the origin. So if I rotate the origin, it will also rotate that texture space box, in turn modifying the rotation of the image. And next we've got the object coordinates. Now the object coordinates are a little bit different, so let's plug this in. You'll notice now we've actually got, probably easier to see if we come across here, the box. If we use generated, we were getting one single image projected from each face of this box that we've selected here. And that's because the coordinates are going from 0 to 1 along each face. So the face is the full image, basically. If we go to object, put that in there, and we'll just visualize the object as well. It's actually based on the origin of the object. So let's just put the origin to the middle of the object. And I'll do right click, set origin to geometry, so it's in the middle. And if we plug this in now, we can see we've actually got 4 images now. And each one of these images, going to top view, is exactly 1 unit. So it says exactly 1 world unit. If I scale this object up, make sure I turn off effect origins only, it has become larger, so it's now 4 units for each image. But if I apply the scale, you can see it's gone back to being 1 unit only. So that's something to bear in mind. And also, this won't work on a deforming mesh. So if I come over here, this object, and let's just deform this mesh again, you'll see it no longer sticks to the surface. But a benefit of using this method is you can actually control the texture from another object. So if I specify a different object to use, here, let's choose this empty. As I move this empty around, it will manipulate the texture's position on here. So I can move it, I can rotate it, and I can scale it as well. So that's the benefit of using the object method. And of course, with all of these, we can manipulate texture coordinates that this outputs using Shift-AS, and we'll drop down a mapping node, drop that on there, and we can do things like rotate, move, or scale on individual axes. Or if we want to do all three at once, we can put down a value node, connect this in, and then we can change, for example, here the scale of the entire thing. So that's additional control you've got after the fact of outputting from this texture coordinate node. And it's worth noting as well that although in this texture image here, we needed to make it a 3D representation, so it had Z coordinates for the image. If we're using a procedural texture, so Shift A, I'll put down one of the procedural textures, maybe, let's say, wave, and I'll plug this one in instead. Connect this one up, and I'll make it rings, and we'll give it a little bit of distortion. These ones we don't need to make into a box or a sphere, etc., because these are three-dimensional already. And just to show you what I mean, if we come across, let's make this so it's pointing upwards. I'll keep the texture coordinates as object so that the texture doesn't stick to the surface. Go into edit mode, and as I move a face, you can see the texture actually changes inside of the model. And that's because it's a 3D procedural texture. So that's why we don't need to worry about setting box or sphere or whatever up on this one. It's already a 3D texture. Okay, so back in the main file now, what we're going to do is use the techniques we've just learned to apply a texture to this quite difficult to unwrap object, in my case, and most likely in your case as well. I'm going to select this picture frame, and I'm going to copy this texture node by pressing Ctrl-C to copy it. I'll choose this object back into isolation mode, and this object's got a material set up. I'm just going to paste in that texture. So Ctrl-V, and now we've got this node pasted in. I'll plug this into the base color. We can't really see the texture very well because we've not yet applied any coordinates. So let's select this one, press Ctrl-T, and now we've got a coordinate system set up, but it's still using, by default, the UV output of the texture coordinate node. What I want to do is change this to either generated or object. Either are fine because it's not going to be deforming. So I'm going to go with generated. And we'll see straight away we're getting a strange result. And again, this is because on the image, we need to change this from flat to box. And now we're getting a much better result. But if we zoom in, there are going to be areas where we can see the transition between the different parts of the image. So here, we see we've got a very definite line. So I'm just going to turn up the blend a little bit until that is unrecognizable. And there we are. So we've got a texture applied to that now. And let's come back out. And we'll go into cycles mode. Let's have a look at the result. I'll just turn overlays off. And now we've got this texture applied to this object without the need to unwrap it. Now let's just isolate it again. If I want to, I can manipulate the rotation, and the rotation is going to be based on the object's local coordinates. So if I want to rotate these horizontal ones, let's just go into Material Preview. If I want to rotate these to be vertical, you can see that the local y-axis, I've got this set to local up here, is pointing that way. So if I want to rotate these this way, I'm going to have to rotate around the y-axis. So in the mapping, I'll get the y-axis and I'll rotate it until I get the angle that I want. Maybe I'll go with something like this. And if I want to scale it, Shift A, and I'll put down a value node and I'll plug this into the scale of the mapping node. And now we can control the scale of that texture as well. So the smaller the value, the bigger the texture will appear. Unless we change this to texture, in which case it's the vice versa. The smaller the number, the smaller it will appear. So some people find that more intuitive, but you can put this to whichever you prefer. I'll leave it on point, and I'll bring it down a little bit. Somewhere like that. And then finally, I can modify the material, maybe by doing a bump map. So let's Shift-A, S, and I'll put down a bump map. And then I'll get the output of this into the height. I'll plug this into the normal on the principal node. And then we're going to get a bit of a bump happening as well. And we can change the strength down until it doesn't look so strange. And we can convert this color image that we've got here into a black and white image ready for this. So Shift-A, S, put down a ramp, drop that in between, and now the output is going to be black and white. So the white areas are going to poke out, the black areas are going to stay stuck in. Let's look at this again. And there we go. All right, so with that done, what I want you to do is the back of the picture frame. I want you to use the same technique we've just used on this to apply the texture to this object. So pause the video, have a go now, and then pick up when you've finished. Okay, so I'll just do it quickly. I'm going to choose this same material. I'm going to apply it to this one. So I'm just going to name this to be wood. Now select this part on the back, and I'll choose the same wood material. But I don't want to modify this one, otherwise I'm going to mess up this picture frame here. So I'm going to change this to its own unique material by clicking the number 2 here. And I'll just call this wood back. Or in fact, let's call it wood stand. And now I can modify this without messing up this one. So I press Ctrl T to set up the mapping for us. I'll change it to generated. And we'll zoom in. And we'll look for any harsh transitions. Make sure I change this to box. And then I want to scale it because it's way too thin there. And that's going to be on the Z, I believe. So if I just change the scale of the Z, we'll zoom in a bit. Something like 0.1. And I want to make sure we don't have any harsh transitions on the edge where the two textures directions meet. So I'll just turn up the blend a little bit. And there we are. And if I want to rotate this so that it's following more in this direction, I'll rotate it around the Z. Like so. And there we are. Let's go into camera view. We'll turn on cycles mode. We'll turn off overlays. And then before I make these objects interact with the HDRI environment by casting shadows onto it and reflections, what I want you to try is put a picture inside the picture frame. So the skills you're going to need are the ones you've already learned, which are how to apply multiple materials to a single object, and also how to position the face in UV space so that it will cover your new materials image. So pause the video, and then when you've finished, come back and I'll show you how I do it. So I'll start off by selecting the picture frame. I'll turn on overlays. We'll go into isolation mode, and I'll go into material preview instead of cycles. And I want to go into the material tab for this object and add a new material slot. And then we'll create a new material in that slot. This material I want to assign to this face here, which is going to be where the picture is. So I'll go into edit mode, number 3 for face mode, and I'll choose just this one face, and I'll assign this new material to that face. I then want to bring in an image texture, so I'm going to drag in from my desktop an image texture. Let's just have a look at it. We'll go into the UV editor up at the top here. We can see we've got this image in there now. Now let's plug this into the base color, and we should start seeing something happen over here. I can now turn off overlays so I can see better the image. I'm going to use, initially, rather than using the UVs, which we've got here, I'm going to do Control T with this node selected, the image node, and this will set up the UV coordinates for us, the automatic ones. And I'm going to use generated. Plug that into the vector, and now you can see it's done not a bad job, but it's not perfectly fit into the image, into the area that I want. So I'm going to use these mapping coordinates, these mapping values, to move this around. So let's not forget, it always scales from the bottom left-hand corner of the image, so the 0, 0 point. So what I want to first do is move this image across so that it aligns with the bottom corner. So let's go into location, and I'll move this now until we get the result we want. So just move it across a little bit until we can't see the edge anymore. I'm going to move it up on the y-axis until we make sure the bottom is also right at the very bottom. And what I can do now is scale it on the X initially, like that, so it's fitting on the right hand side. I've gone a little bit too far there, so let's bring it back across, and then we'll do the same for the top. We'll scale it on the Y until we get the top of the image just inside the bounds of the frame. And there we are. So that's one way we could do it. The alternative way would be to use the UV coordinates. So let's just cut this tie, Control right click and drag to cut the wire. And by the way, if you're seeing additional faces in the UV image editor other than what you've got selected in the 3D editor, then you just need to click this button here, the Sync UV Selection button. And that will make sure that you can only see the one that you've got actually selected in the 3D viewport. Now I'll get these UV coordinates. I'm going to scale this so it fits inside perfectly the image. Let's try initially with the UV and then pack islands. I'll turn off rotate, scale it though, and I'll choose OK. So I've scaled it up, but it's not perfect and it's also upside down. So I'm going to make sure I select all of the vertices and I'll do R180 to flip that 180 degrees. And then I'll take these side ones, just make it a bit bigger. Just the side ones, making sure I'm in vertex mode here so I can select them individually. If you're in face mode, then you can't select the vertices, you can only select the face. So make sure you're in vertex mode, select those. I'm going to move these across now until they go all the way to the edge. So G and then X to make sure I lock it to the X axis. Keep moving across until that's all the way at the edge there. And there we go. So that's the second way you can do it. You're generally better to always use UVs if it's easy enough because you'll get more control over the result. And then lastly, let's go back into cycles mode. I want to give this picture frame a bit of a shine to it so it looks as though it's behind glass. So I'll turn the roughness right down. And now we can see the reflections in the glass. If it's a bit too strong, then I'll just reduce the specular a little bit, or the IOR level in Blender 4, to control how bright those reflections are. That's looking quite good. And we'll come back out of isolation mode